As Deep opened his eyes, panic struck like a lightning bolt. He couldn't move. His body was trapped under a heavy blanket of snow, his face frozen with a thin layer of ice. The cold bit into his skin as more snow fell, suffocating him inch by inch. Suddenly, a stabbing pain ripped through his face. A climber had fallen right on top of him. He felt the cold steel of a crampon slice into his lip, and then, nothing. The climber's body twitched once, then went still. Deep's chest tightened as a horrifying realization dawned. This person had died, crushed and suffocated by the merciless snow. The lifeless weight pressed down harder, and Deep screamed. His voice tore through the icy air, only to fade into the unending silence of the frozen wilderness. This was the DKD-2 disaster. On October 4th, 2022, 7 instructors, 34 students, 3 porters, and a nursing assistant began a training climb on Drapakad 2, known as DKD-2, deep in the Himalayan mountains of India. The mountain, standing at 18,600 feet, wasn't the tallest or the most challenging in the region, but that didn't mean it was safe. At this altitude, every step was a battle against altitude sickness, freezing temperatures, and sudden storms. Despite its risks, DKD-2 had a clean record, no fatalities. That's why the Nehru Institute of Mountaineering, NIM, one of India's most respected climbing schools, used it for training. The mountain was considered a safe zone, ideal for teaching climbers how to survive the dangers of high-altitude expeditions. The climbers were students, some military, others ordinary adventurers, drawn by the promise of mastering the mountains. NIM's courses were so popular that there was a long waiting list. Students came here, confident in the mountain's safety, trusting the legend of its avalanche-free slopes. But the mountains don't care about legends. By late September 2022, the group was training in harsh conditions on the Dokriani Glacier. Relentless bad weather followed them as they prepared for their climb. On October 2nd, they pushed forward, reaching summit base camp at 18,600 feet. Supplies were set and tents were pitched, but the altitude began to take its toll. Some climbers felt weak, dizzy, and nauseated. Altitude sickness was creeping in like an invisible predator. The instructors warned the group, "Summiting isn't worth your life. Retreat if you're not ready." Some heeded the warning, descending to safety. Others pushed on, eager to conquer the peak. They didn't know it yet, but the ones who turned back were the lucky ones. On October 3rd, the remaining climbers reached summit camp by noon. Exhausted but determined, they ate, rested, and prepared for the final push. By 1 a.m. on October 4th, the camp came alive. Climbers awoke in the freezing darkness, their breath clouding the air. Among them was 23-year-old Anush Sharma, her heart racing with excitement and fear. Nearby, Sunil Lawani, a former corporate marketer turned adventurer, checked his gear, ready to chase his dream. None of them could imagine the nightmare waiting above. With Deepthar, a part-time fund manager making his first attempt at a 5,000 m peak, the group began their climb. It was 3:30 a.m. on October 4th. 7 instructors, 34 students, 3 porters, 1 nurse, and a mysterious skier, aiming to descend DKD-2's summit on skis, set out into the icy darkness. The mountain, cloaked in fresh, untested snow after the monsoons, was eerily silent. The early hours were cold, but optimism buzzed through the group. The climb felt promising, at first. At 16,800 feet, they faced their first real challenge, a jagged feature called Rambo Rock. Hooking into fixed lines, they cautiously traversed its ice-slicked face, one by one. Although it was tough, everyone managed. But the snow ahead was deep and unstable, hiding dangers below. As daylight cracked, the summit loomed near. Excitement rippled through the climbers, but Lawani, halfway up the line, froze as a small slide of snow rushed past him. "A mini avalanche," he muttered nervously. Memories of the mountain's perfect safety record calmed him. For 40 years, DKD-2 had claimed no lives. That assurance pushed him forward. At around 8:30 a.m., Sharma reached the summit snowfield. Just as he unhooked his carabiner in excitement, a faint crack snaked through the snow beneath him. Then, in an instant, the mountain roared to life. The crack widened, and the entire snowfield began sliding downhill. Lawani watched in horror as the climber ahead was swallowed by the wave. Before he could react, the snow hit him like a speeding train. Desperately, he slammed his ice axe into the slope, but the force of the avalanche was unstoppable. The world became a chaos of tumbling ice and snow. Lawani felt himself suffocating, drowning in the frozen mass. Nearby, Deep stared in disbelief as the avalanche tore through the line of climbers, sending them hurtling down the mountain. Before he could scream, he, too, was swept away, the snow swallowing him whole. And then, there was nothing but falling. Deep plummeted down the mountain, convinced he was falling to his death. But suddenly, the fall ended with a brutal thud. He landed on his stomach, his head above the snow. He gasped for air, but snow kept cascading down, piling on him. As it collected on his exposed head, he prayed desperately for it to stop, dreading the thought of suffocating. Suddenly, a sharp object struck his face, a crampon. It belonged to another climber who had landed on top of him. The crampon sliced Deep's lip, and blood began to seep from his mouth. The snow finally stopped falling, but Deep lay trapped, his face inches from the lifeless foot of the climber. The foot twitched once, then stilled. Deep realized the climber had suffocated. His screams echoed through the stillness. Nearby, Lawani was buried in the snow, his face also covered. He shook his head side to side, creating a small air pocket. He could barely move, but the pocket allowed him to breathe. Trapped and helpless, he silently recited a Hindu mantra to calm his fears of impending death. Not far away, 26-year-old student S.J. Gusan regained consciousness. He had been knocked out by the avalanche. Like Deep, his head was above the snow, but his body was buried. Trapped in the crevasse, Gusan thought of his young daughter, wondering how she would survive without him. Some climbers were fortunate. They stopped before falling into the crevasse, or were above the avalanche entirely. Sharma, one of the lucky ones, glanced back over his shoulder only to see an empty slope. Everyone was just gone, he later recalled. In total, 34 climbers had vanished, swept 80 feet into the crevasse. Snow piled on top of most of them, burying them alive. Survivors like Deep, Lawani, and Gusan listened in horror to the agonizing screams of their trapped companions. Some cried out for help, others called for their parents. The cries faded into silence as the buried climbers succumbed to their injuries. At base camp, instructor Shahed Khan, who had descended the day before with an ill student, was reading a book in his tent. Earlier, he had tracked the climbers' progress on the summit via radio, everything seeming in order. But moments later, chaos erupted. A porter ran by with a stretcher, and Khan's quartermaster ordered him to follow. Khan quickly realized something terrible had happened near the summit. The rescue team mobilized immediately. Khan prepared for the ascent, but he knew the grim reality. Survivors in avalanche conditions rarely lasted beyond 30 minutes. A helicopter was dispatched, racing against time, while military personnel from advanced base camp ascended ahead of Khan's team. By 1:30 p.m., hours after the avalanche, neither the rescue team nor the helicopter had reached the accident site. Every passing moment made survival less likely, turning the mission into what they feared most: a recovery operation. The rescuers knew it had turned into a recovery mission. As they pushed forward, the weather turned into a nightmare. Whiteout conditions with rain, sleet, snow, and howling winds. By the time they reached summit camp, it felt like nature itself was against them. Down in the crevasse, Lawani could breathe but couldn't move. His body was buried in the freezing snow, his hands numb and lifeless like wood. After what felt like an eternity, an instructor finally uncovered Lawani's head, wiping snow away from his glasses. "Don't worry, you're alive. We'll make it out," the instructor assured him. Meanwhile, the anonymous skier, freed from the snow, joined in the frantic search for survivors. Without proper digging equipment, they used their hands, helmets, and skis to unearth the buried climbers. Deep Thar was eventually pulled out, but his condition was grim. His screams echoed in the icy void. "I don't have my leg! I can't stand!" Shaking violently and drenched, he was wrapped in a blanket, surrounded by 4 lifeless bodies. Tragically, not everyone could be saved. Savita Kansal, who had set a national record by climbing Everest and Makalu in just 16 days, was found with her hands cupped over her mouth, trying to create a breathing space. She didn't make it. A nurse's assistant attempted CPR on another instructor, but it was too late. As the survivors were brought down to summit camp, they were met by Instructor Khan, who provided warm clothing and tried to lift their shattered spirits. Out of the 34 climbers who fell into the crevasse, only 6 survived. Deep Thar, Sunil Lewani, Saraj Gusain, Akit Kandal, and the anonymous skier. The other 28, aged 18 to 47, perished. Khan described the scene as a valley of death and silence. The weight of leaving so many behind was unbearable. "It's hard to describe," he said. "Seeing myself and the other instructors return alive, while 27 of our trainees, who trusted us completely, were now dead, lost to forces beyond human control." Over the following days, 19 of the 29 bodies were recovered. But the mental toll of the accident left deep scars on the survivors and rescuers. An avalanche is one of the deadliest threats in mountaineering, capable of wiping out entire groups in a single instant. As more climbers risk everything to summit the world's highest peaks, tragedies like this will continue to haunt the mountains. For more chilling tales, subscribe to the Tales of Twists.